This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
I'm very pleased to have Linda Grant here. I think he's known perhaps as a novelist, hopefully, or possibly a journalist, but not as an historian.
No.
And so you might think, so what? This is a bit wacky even for you, Flet. But but no, there is a reason and a logic to it, because the book here, which is your most recent one, does to some extent rely on the sort of social history of the 1970s. And I thought it would be quite interesting to get somebody who's not an historian, who's written a novel which features some historical detail, to come and talk about how that worked from the perspective of a novelist, and then just to see, what an audience of primarily historians thought about how that worked. So hopefully it'll be quite an interesting session. I don't think we're going to go on too long, but it might be just interesting to explore how that kind of looks from both sides of the thing. So over to you, Linda.
Right, thank you. No, I'm not an historian, and my socialism extends to being, until very recently, the secretary of the Crouch End branch of the Hornsey and Wood Green Labour Party. Very good chance of getting rid of Lynn Featherstone in May. Problems with the mansion tax.
Yes.
So anyway, very kind of Keith to invite me to speak. Every time I publish a novel, people say, is it autobiographical? And I say, yes, it is based on my experiences as a pimp in pre-war Budapest. This novel is somewhat autobiographical because it takes, the first part of it takes place at an unnamed university in Yorkshire, new plate glass university in Yorkshire between 1972 and 1975, and then the aftermath thereof. And it really came about because a couple of years ago, two and a half years ago, I went back to York to receive an honorary doctorate. Now, if anybody, I was given the honorary doctorate by the Chancellor, and I had known the Chancellor when we were both, in my first term, when we were both on the student newspaper, and he was this particularly yobby, mature student with a sort of very straggly beard, and hush puppies, which were generally on the table in the bar while he kind of held forth and pontificated. And he had arrived, he had been taken into the university as a mature student with 2 A levels, I think a D and an E, right? But the politics department, which was led by a guy called Graham Moody, was very keen to take a risk on sort of slightly left field candidates. And so it was that they offered a place to Greg Dyke, who became the Chancellor. And the campus was, at that time, the sound that reverberated was, get your socialist worker, get your socialist worker. And this was a figure always dressed in a black jacket with a red shirt with some badges and sort of starey, intense eyes like this. Some years later, I was on a train, about 1978, I think. I was on a train, got onto a train, and there was the former head of the Students' Union. And he said, I've got something really strange to tell you, he said. I was, his job, this was a press officer for ASH, the anti-smoking campaign, and he was ringing round Fleet Street with a press release, and he rings the Daily Express, and a voice at the other end says, Pete Hitchens, news desk. And he says, Pete, what are you doing on the Express? And he says, I'm infiltrating the establishment. And I had a long conversation with Pete I'd known his wife about his transition. But at any rate, what happened was, when I went back to get that honorary doctorate, you go to university, you're 18, you're kind of an amoeba. And I went there for the very, very simple reason that at the time, and possibly still now, it had a very good reputation for English. So it was basically, the English department was full of Oxbridge, people who put it second after Oxford or Cambridge, or people who really wanted to go there because it was a new university. So it was when I was there that I began to understand a lot of things that I had not understood at the time. So the novel never names the university, it is York. So I'm just going to read 4 pages, which really encapsulates both the atmosphere at the time and the underlying things that we didn't really quite understand. So this is the narrator speaking with hindsight from the present, who has blagged her way into university with a C, a D and an E, rather like Greg Dyke, by pretending to the English department that she is the cousin of Allen Ginsberg, and has a postcard to prove it, although in fact she isn't. When I applied to the university, I didn't know anything about it. I wasn't completely sure where it was, in fact. In fact, it had its own story unknown to me. It turned out that I had unwittingly applied to be a lab rat in a giant social experiment, a benign one, but architecturally the whole place had been designed to embed a certain principle that was to mould our education and our future lives. The campus, when I visited it last month for the first time in nearly 40 years, looked like a fossil uncovered from the Paleolithic era. Low beige concrete, confidently and futuristically modernist, consisting of a series of prefabricated buildings interlinked by covered walkways, open on both sides to the lashing winds from across the Pennines, and set around an artificial plastic-bottomed lake stocked with ducks, Canada geese and other wildfowl, the names of which I no longer remember. Someone remarked, it was actually Peter Hitchens remarked, that it looked like a spaceship that had docked to collect an experimental cargo of passengers. That was us. Over the years, the university has sprawled out into the surrounding fields, and when you leave the original site, if it were not for the grey roof of the sky, you could be in the azure uplands of Silicon Valley. The old buildings, modest in scale, are dwarfed by the brasher, more recent structures and have stained quite badly. No patina of antiquity has made the concrete boxes look distinguished. Eventually they will have to be demolished. The land on which the university was built was acquired from the estate of a 17th century manor house, russet bricked in the mellow autumn sunshine, which is when we all saw it for the first time. The house itself was now the headquarters of the university's administration. Topiary was planted in the garden where I once played croquet with Bobby and understood for the first time the essential viciousness of the game. Now, 40 years later, the shaped trees are enormous, as if giants had dragged their rooted feet on the lawn. A few weeks after I arrived, it sank in with queasy despair that there was nowhere to go but where we were already. We students had walled ourselves in, robed our bodies in that concrete cladding. The university was so new that the ancient city with its hulking cathedral had no student bars or student quarter. It turned its backs on us. We were not wanted. Many pubs would not serve male customers with long hair, so we were limited socially to the campus. Musically, it was a dire period, the time of glam rock, which we despised, knitted tank tops, kipper ties and huge lapels, Gary Glitter, Alvin Stardust. Everything that had been our recent youth was both exhausted and exaggerated. It was the age, though we didn't know it at the time, of celebrity paedophiles. We were becoming ridiculous when we were barely 20. One evening I sat on the floor of a dining room watching the New York Dolls. The dolls had an urban stink to them. They smelled of hot dog stands, drains, the rasp of the subway train, and they seemed to us malevolent. They would do us damage. We sensed a change coming. We still thought we had nothing to do with us. Both we students and the university itself have been conceived in the early years of the new Elizabethan age. Spaceships, the conquest of Everest, the 4-minute mile, whiz for atoms. Our parents grunted and moaned and cried in ecstasy in their beds, sweatily shooting sperm out into ova. The young queen arrived back from Kenya to sit, dressed in a normal Hartnell gown, on a gold throne at Westminster Abbey, and have a heavy crown placed on her crisply permed head. That frightened, submissive face slightly haunts me now in this Diamond Jubilee year of her coronation. At this time, our founders were mapping ideas for the post-war era. They had watched the human soul become subjugated to the all-encompassing idea, which is invariably shod in steel-capped boots. Their plan was to defeat ideology with a quiet, humane liberalism of human rights, equality, and a spirit of public service. Our founders wanted us to celebrate all the human weaknesses, our frailties, foibles, idiosyncrasies, the many small ways in which we are ourselves, not robots. People have proved to be fragile, they could be easily smashed. The founders encouraged us to be robust in our scepticism. The freedom of the university was the plate on which our lives had been handed to us, real freedoms. For the university, the administration had decided it would not act in loco parentis. There were no rules, no gating, and apart from attending tutorials and handing in some essays, we were left alone to do much as we liked, which of course we did, and some followed their own self-destructive impulses to hell and others survived. Lectures were an optional extra. We were encouraged to question, doubt, answer back, retort, rebel. If we wished to dress in outlandish clothes, that was our right. If we wanted to follow daft Eastern mystical practices like transcendental meditation, oming our way at the crying sky, then we were free to do so. If we wished to blow our minds with hallucinogenic drugs on a path to enlightenment, then no one would interfere. In those days, the government paid us to spend 3 years being students, which meant, in those days, a way of life suited to Renaissance philosopher kings, until we were turfed out blinking and unprotected like baby koalas ejected from the womb onto the alien leafless world of an Antarctic ice floe. We were a tiny oasis of unreality in a world that is itself semi-forgotten, a time when the university computer took up a whole building and was tended by maths students in white coats. On the other hand, we were, I suppose, pioneers of environmentalism, chewing indigestible substances, brown rice, brown bread, brown sugar, while our parents still ate processed cheese and instant mashed potato and thought it was progress. A few of us really did hug trees. On our first real day as undergraduates, once we had settled into our accommodation, we gathered in the concrete rotunda on tiers of seats, 900 of us. We were only a few years out of childhood, the boys boasting faint lines of hair on their upper lips. Our founders addressed us. He spoke of revolting students. Better revolt, he told us with smiling paternal middle-aged benevolence, than be contented cows. I thought, this is amazing. If only the perfume counter ladies could see me now. And then I knew that I had to forget that the perfume counter had ever existed, or that I had ever been behind it. No one is going to understand you, Adele. The past is in hiding. That girl wasn't you. She was a succubus. A succubus is a devil who inhabits a woman's body, and consorts with men in her sleep. Well, the Vice-Chancellor who uttered those very words and told us not to be contented cows was Lord James of Rusholme, who, as Eric James, had been the famous headmaster of Manchester Grammar School. And really he retired as Vice-Chancellor at the end of my first year, but he was the driving force behind the founding of York. So he had been a Fabian socialist, sorry, I'm just getting this from Wikipedia, who believed passionately in equality of opportunity. Nevertheless, he made a sharp distinction between equality of opportunity and uniformity of treatment, and his philosophy was meritocracy. So what he was trying to do was to found a new university which would have very high standards, and he poached from Cambridge as honorary visiting professor F.R. Leavis, And Leavis brought with him a tranche of acolytes, so that most of the English department was taken up with Leavis's disciples, and that shot the department kind of, right to the top of the sort of, the league tables very quickly, because the university was only founded in 1964, and the campus was only really built in the late 60s. So it's a kind of, it's pretty quick. So it's very different from universities like, say, Essex or Sussex or Warwick, because it was an elitist institution. And one of the things that he did, which was very interesting because it was reflected in the architecture and the philosophy of the university were completely bound up together, which was something we hadn't understood. It was based on a college system, and what we assumed at the time was that it was simply aping Oxbridge. But that wasn't actually the idea. That wasn't his thought. It was more extreme than that. What he wanted to do was he was trying to found something which in America is called a liberal arts college. So there were no applied subjects of any kind. They were basically they were all A-level subjects. If you couldn't do it for A-level, you probably weren't going to be able to study it at York. So there was no law, there was no medicine, no engineering. There was no computer science department. It was maths. And his idea was that if we were not separated into departments, then the arts would talk to the sciences and the sciences would talk to the arts. And the specific rationale behind this was to defeat totalitarianism. So it was not a socialist view, it was absolutely a liberal view. His idea was that the sciences would teach the arts logic and the arts would teach the sciences humanity, right? And so there were no departmental buildings. The departments were inside the colleges. You could be in your student study bedroom, and next door to it there would be your supervisor in his office. That was the way the whole thing was set up. And the idea of freedom was enormously significant because it was unlike any university that any of my friends were at, in that there simply were no rules. And I remember one guy who failed his degree, and the secretary of the English department saying, we tried and tried and tried and tried to pass him. We just did everything we could to try and pass him. But the problem was he hadn't turned up for any finals, so we were kind of backed into a corner. The politics of the time were characterised, I think, with sort of 2-3 different strands. One was the internecine war between the International Socialists and the International Marxist group, who essentially took up. So it's sort of basically it was the Trots or nothing. I can't remember the CP. I cannot remember the Labour group. I only remember the various forms of horizontal recruitment that were taking place at the time. And I had shared a house with a girl who joined IS, and I knew Peter's wife, Eve Ross, whose father, David Ross, was an American, I think he's, do you know, American communist.
Yeah.
And anyway, Peter had recruited this girl, and he asked me what had happened to her. And I said, well, it's your worst nightmare, really, because, she had a brown baby and then lived on benefits in a deck access council flat. And he sent me an email of such excoriating guilt that he felt that he'd ruined her life. So the other two elements, what happened was in the first first week, 2 new organisations started on campus, which were the York Women's Action Group and the Gay Liberation Front. So that time in the 70s, it was the 2 main political strands were Trotskyism and gender politics. I mean, the issues that I particularly remember, I remember the student union, voting week after week after week after week to send a telegram, to pay for a telegram to send to the American embassy to denounce, whatever was going on that particular week in the Vietnam War. So Vietnam was the main issue, the political issue that we were dealing with, but there was also some industrial politics that was going on as well in Yorkshire. But I think that the key and most exciting politics were the women's movement and GLF, and those 2 organisations had joint meetings, and really, we had arrived there. I think we had all read. Nobody read Betty Friedan because we were teenagers, and the idea of housewives in America having anything to do with us was so the book we'd read was obviously Germaine Greer, The Female Eunuch, and then those of us in the English department were reading Kate Millet's Sexual Politics, partly because it was a denunciation of D.H. Lawrence. And gradually more and more books came out, and you would hear, there'd been another book until the summer I left. I remember going into a bookshop and there was a whole shelf of feminist books, and I was thinking, Jesus, how am I going to catch up with this? Because you'd read everything. The flip side of all of this, which was something which really only dawned on us later, was that with this tremendous freedom, there was absolutely no student support whatsoever. I mean, there was nothing. There was no pastoral support of any kind. And there were at least 3 people that I knew personally who arrived at university with what would, become really quite serious mental health problems, bipolar and schizophrenia and anorexia, which the university did. There was no form of counselling whatsoever, absolutely nothing. There was a medical centre which, basically you were given a standing prescription for Valium. Everybody was taking Valium because that was all you could get. There was a tremendous amount of, the head of the English department, when I went back, said that she'd heard that in the 70s and up till the 80s, when the department assembled to do a viva, the chair of department's question was, does anybody have a particular interest, which means, are you sleeping with the student? This was just completely rife. So there was a lot of psychological problems which were simply not dealt with, and the university was located literally next door to a large private mental asylum, and which was called The Retreat, and so they would say, oh, so-and-so, have you seen so-and-so in the Retreat? Right. I mean, to go to a closed psychiatric facility when actually, you can imagine the kind of services you should have been getting. What happened, and it's at the centre of this novel, but I was not there. It happened a year after I left, but to a girl that I knew very well, was that she died of that, sort of mixture of alcohol and Valium, and in a student house. And when her housemates rang her supervisor to say that somebody had to go to the morgue and identify her, he said, well, as she's dead, she's not really my supervision student anymore. number one. And number two, it didn't actually happen on campus, so I don't really think it's my responsibility. And that was a kind of tremendous, I think, wake-up call to all of us. So the number of students there at the time was 2,700 students. When I went back 2 years ago, it was to a place unrecognisable. So it had been built on this clasp system. I think I've got a note about this here. Clasp was a system of prefabricated concrete. Consortium of Local Authorities Special Programme was CLASP, and the cynics called it a collection of loosely assembled steel parts. So
Wasn't that Roland Point?
I don't know.
It's prefabricated steel girders with concrete.
Yes, that's right. So they were built around the largest plastic bottom lake in Europe. The library was actually slipping down the hill. And what had happened was there were now something like 18,000 students, 27,000 students, anyway, vastly bigger. What had happened in the early 90s was that the realization that this very liberal, idealistic notion of trying to create a university where you had you did not have subjects with any application, right? It's really, really crucial that the subject should not have an application. So there being no professional subjects meant that by the early 90s, the university was plummeting down the international league tables, and they had to take things in hand, and they had to undergo a huge expansion. So the original concrete campus was now completely surrounded by glass towers, a huge student union building, which was precisely against the ethos of the founders, because we were all supposed to be in our colleges. There was not supposed to be any kind of centralized student union building. And we were taken out a short walk away. The university is on the edge of York. It's built on a village in fields in a village called Heslington. So it's not in the city centre. It's walking distance. But so those fields were now surrounded by these glass towers, which were badged with Sun Systems. Right. So what had happened was that the place had been essentially kind of privatised, if you like, in terms of the links between certainly the computer department and Silicon Valley. So that was a kind of major change. The whole, I mentioned it in the extract, but I remember walking past the computer building, which is a building about sort of 3 times the length of this one, a bit wider, was tended by maths students in white coats. And I remember many years later when people started talking about personal computers, and I said, well, I'll never be able to operate a computer because you've got to have a degree in maths. So all that had changed, and it had, all the normal faculties of any normal university. And of course, the counselling, there were now, proper counselling departments, and one of the things that a word which I had only ever read in American novels, which was alumni, right? We never spoke of ourselves as alumni. Greg Dyke explained to me that they had this very active alumni association to raise money, but secondly, I said there that, we were like Renaissance philosopher kings, but we became baby koalas, because so what happened was we graduated in 1975 in the middle of recession. And, you know, there was a milk round for people doing, you know, physics and geography who, you know, could go off to work for some corporation. But for those of us, you know, us Ponce students, you know, who had expected that we were going to publishing or the BBC or something like that, we really didn't know, because we were not allowed to think about it. And in fact, it was against the university statutes to have a job during term time. I mean, that we were not allowed to work. So nobody, you know, there was no such thing as work experience. So anyway, what they were saying so we were just completely lost and came down to London, lived in squats and short life houses and stuff like that. And took us a long time to find our feet. So they were explaining that the purpose of the Alumni Association was to hook up particularly students whose middle-class parents didn't have the right connections or who didn't live in London with internships. So the sort of from this moment in my life in October 1972, when I sat being terribly excited by Lord James telling me that I should not be a contented cow, we really moved into a world of the university as corporation, and you know, a transformation which had, you know, occurred in my lifetime, and one which I think made me consider and think about the whole role of those post-war plate glass universities, which so many of us went to, and which really were the kind of, you know, for the baby boomers, without the post-war expansion, you know, without that post-war higher education expansion, far fewer of us would have gone to university, although hardly any of us went to university anyway. I'll just finish with an observation about the baby boomers. I was born in 1951. It is said that if you were born in 1948, you were the luckiest person alive if you played your cards right, because you've got the welfare state, the NHS, the grammar schools, sex, drugs, rock and roll, expansion, higher education expansion, and if you're really lucky, you retired in 2008, just before the credit crunch, on a final salary pension. So, you know, I think that in writing this novel, part of it is my awareness of how fortunate we were, but part of it is some kind of interrogation of those ideas. Of the 50s, and also I think the realization that when we talk about the 60s and the 70s, the people who made the real social changes were not us, we were teenagers, but the men and women of the 30s and 40s. Thank you.
Very much.